On Monday, May 18th, the government watchdog group Judicial Watch published a selection of formally classified documents that were obtained from the U.S. Department of Defense and the State Department. Now, these were acquired through a lawsuit, and the document reveals that the Obama administration knew that al-Qaeda terrorists were planning the Benghazi attack 10 days before it happened. But perhaps more importantly, the newly declassified documents are really just another piece of growing evidence that the West has funded, trained, and promoted the ISIS terrorist group in the Middle East. The documents are dated in 2012, and they're coming from the Defense Intelligence Agency, and it's more than just unintended consequences of Western war policies that have aimed, and still do, at isolating the Bashar al-Assad administration. This document, as you can see here, was formally classified secret, and it predicted the rise of ISIS. And far from describing them as an enemy, they're viewed as a strategic asset. Hence, of course, the funding and training of this armed opposition to the Syrian government. Now, the report was shared among various government agencies, including CENTCOM, the CIA, the FBI, the DHS, the NGA, and the State Department, just to name a few. The newly declassified documents state that for the West, Gulf countries, and Turkey, who support the opposition, or ISIS, it goes on here to say, there is the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria, and this is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want in order to isolate the Syrian regime. So, I mean, there it is. And there's even actually video evidence. The former Syrian ambassador Robert Ford's administration and a UK-based conflict armament research report which traces the rockets that were recovered from ISIS to a joint Saudi-CIA program. And now, of course, we have this DIA report, which also makes these following conclusions. That the establishment of a Salafist principality in eastern Syria is exactly what the Western powers and ISIS want in order to weaken the Assad government. And in keeping with the humanitarian war propaganda, no-fly zones will be established so as to create safe havens for areas that are conquered by the Islamic insurgents. So, in other words, using the pretext of a humanitarian war, we won't bomb certain areas so as to allow the Salafist principality to gain a stronghold. Notice the very same humanitarian war pretext is what's used by the corporate state media and the politicians here as the reasons that we need to reinvade Iraq and stay in Afghanistan. You know, it's a humanitarian mission now, apparently. This report also reveals that the U.S. intelligence agencies knew full well back in 2012 that the creation of this Sunni Islamic State would be devastating to a unifying Iraq, and it would just lead to more Middle Eastern instability. Yet, of course, they went ahead and did it anyway. Now, while we here at PFT have been covering the real origins of ISIS since the group emerged, the larger players in the Canadian media have stayed completely mum on this report. You know, you'd think that perhaps they would, considering this is an election year, maybe want to report on it. Now, although we all know how phony elections are, but still, the nice thing about them is they do get the common person interested in politics for the first time in like 4 years, and that always ends up being a good opportunity to promote the message of truth and liberty. So, for example, in preparation for an election, Stephen Harper and the Conservatives are mounting this comprehensive defense of their foreign policy. But I mean, we don't need to look any further than this declassified U.S. intelligence report that shows that the West is the aggressor, and that puppet masters behind Stephen Harper don't have a leg to stand on. Just point out how anything but peaceful relations abroad is asking for retaliation on our doorsteps. and how, given public reaction to terrorist attacks and opportunities for state power, well, we shouldn't be surprised when the government provokes or actually initiates these retaliatory attacks. Harper spoke to around 1,000 members of the Jewish Community Council who assembled to honor him for his unreasonable support of the state of Israel. He goes on to say here, "I know there continues to be those who question the wisdom of our policy. Just as they once wished we would be more embracing of Putin, now they would wish us to be more ambivalent about Israel." He goes on here, "Canadians know that we cannot opt out of the world. Wanting humanitarian assistance for the people of Iraq and Syria is no excuse for opposing military action against ISIS. Canada can do both. Canada should do both. And Canada is doing both. We have joined this international mission because it is not merely in the wider interests of the global community. We do this because it's in Canada's national interests." Well, if it's Canada's interest is defined as the elite's interest, well, then everything that Harper said is more or less accurate. Humanitarian assistance for the terrorists of Syria and military action against these very same people in Iraq. All for freedom, of course. And it certainly isn't going to just end with Harper. Despite some attacks in his speech, one of Harper's political opponents are just going to continue the status quo of the global community, assuming one of them wins, that is. We can actually even assume that they're going to be worse, as the wars are just going to continue on, I'm sure. But the environmental eugenics agenda is probably going to be kicked up a notch. And plus, a lot of Canadians just hate Harper right now. So having a new friendly face as the Prime Minister is probably just going to put people back to sleep, inattentive to the real dangers of a democratic government. Not that I'd like to see Harper stay around any longer or anything. But in the meantime, here we have yet another piece of evidence in our growing pile of proof that ISIS is a creation of the Western war machine. Now let's see the establishment try to spin this one. Thanks for watching, folks. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Check the links in the description for all the sources to this video. And stay tuned. We got a lot more video reports coming very soon right here at pressfortruth.ca.